Hi everybody and welcome to another episode of the 3D Print Zone. So in this video I'm doing a Cura tutorial and this is part of a video series. So in the first video I showed you kind of how to install and set up the software and then just the general layout of the software itself. In the second video I kind of went into some of the basic settings within Cura which can get you by for kind of 95 to 99% of prints. You could just get by with basic settings. But in this video, I'm going to be talking about some of the more advanced settings that may or may not be helpful to you. And we'll kind of walk through the Cura software and you can kind of better understand what those settings are. I did want to show you here. So this is a good example of one of the things I'm going to be showing in this video is something called spiral mode, which was how this 3D print here was made. And you can see I have this cool remote and light disc inside the 3D print. That's something that I use on a lot of 3D prints. It's pretty neat. You can see here it's a disc that you can put in a print. You can put it underneath a print. And I find that it really brings life to your model. So we'll put that back in here. And it's cool. It has a remote where you can set different colors. So for example, we can go to a red there, kind of a green teal, and you can have it flicker and change colors and different things like that. So I will leave a link. And it's an affiliate link to this product in the description. So if it's something that you're interested in, feel free to pick up some of those. Are pretty neat. But anyways, let's dive right into the model here, and we're going to go through on my screen on Cura some of the more advanced settings. Again, my setup, I've got my laptop here, and my 3D printer is an Ender 5 that you could see here. So jumping into my screen here, you could see from the previous video we're looking at a frog model that we're going through in Cura. So diving right into advanced settings. So the way you would go about that is you're going to come here and go to the advanced button here under the hamburger. So we were previously on basic. You could see when we go to advanced, there's a couple other options that show up down here, as well as some additional options within each one of these drop downs. So I'm not going to go through every single setting and what every single one means. And to be fully transparent, there are a few items in here that I don't ever use and I'm not really that familiar or comfortable explaining what they are. They're just not settings that you would need in almost any print. But there are, the nice thing about Cura, it's a software that has the capability to fine-tune settings down pretty much as fine as you can go to get the model to print exactly how you want it. And that's a nice, feature of Cura, that they have such a broad range of settings. But so looking at quality, I think most of these settings are the same kind of settings that were in the basic settings. So there's not too much to talk about here. Again, you kind of can go through and adjust the actual width of your lines. And one setting that you may be interested in is the initial layer line width. So if you are having trouble where the first layer is not sticking that well to the print bed, in addition to raising the print bed temperature and adding some sort of platform adhesion, you can also make this initial layer line width slightly larger. So for example, you could change this to 110 or 120%, and that's going to make the lines on the first print a little bit wider, and it'll help it give that extra surface area it needs to keep the print down. If we go into shell, this gives you a couple different options here. There's a check to optimize wall printing order. So this, as it reads here, optimize the order in which walls are printed as to reduce the number of retractions and the distance traveled. So we, in the previous video, talked about kind of printer extrusion retractions, and then also the distance traveled is anytime that the nozzle needs to make a long travel to another part on the print bed. So this is a way to kind of optimize for your the walls on the print. There are a couple other options here specific to the top and bottom layer thicknesses. So we talked before about having you could set how many layers you want for the top and bottom, and this is just giving you a little bit more control in terms of the actual thickness of those. For infill, there's also more options here. So before we really only had the option to control the density and the infill pattern. This gives you the ability to control the infill line distance. So that's the distance between any infill lines. You can add a multiplier to convert each infill line to many lines. So for example, it'll take one line and split it into two or three if you adjust this multiplier. You also can adjust, what percentage of overlap you have with infill. So a higher overlap would give you kind of stronger parts if you're finding that your part can need some additional support. And there's also a couple other settings here, but I think those are kind of the key ones for infill. Under material, you have a couple more options. So instead of just what printing temperature and bed temperature, you can also set what temperature you want specific for the initial layer. So again, that initial layer is so critical to your print. You may want, for example, to have that initial layer print at a higher temperature just to make it really kind of flatten out and stick better on the print bed. So maybe you adjust that, 5 or 10 degrees Celsius for that initial layer if you find you need that. You also can adjust kind of your initial and final printing temperatures. So again, at the very beginning of your print and at the very end, maybe you can cool down a little bit as you get towards the end, but that's something that you'd have to see, right? A lot of these settings you won't need unless you start a print and that print keeps failing. If you find that the platform is nice and level, you've leveled the bed, and you have all the basic settings set to something reasonable and you're still having issues, that's when you're going to come in and look at some of these finer details on some of the more advanced settings. So speed gives you quite a lot of controls here. There's all different movements that the extruder is going to go through, and you have the ability to control the speed of all these different types of movements. So how fast is the infill printing? Infill is something that the user or the whoever's the final person who's going to have the 3D print, if it's something like this, you don't see the infill on the inside of this print necessarily, and so maybe you don't care if it looks perfect or whatnot, and you say, okay, I'm going to crank the speed up a little higher on infill, just because I'm not as worried about that coming out perfect. The wall speed, on the other hand, is something that you may want to actually make slower because that's going to be the outer perimeter of your part, and that is going to be seen by the person who actually has the 3D print. And so you may want to actually make this 20 millimeters per second or 30, or here the default is set to 40. But that'll give you make sure that as the nozzle is going around the outside of the print, it's printing that really slowly and meticulously. You can also control the top and bottom, how fast it prints the supports itself. The travel speed we mentioned before is how quickly it's moving between 2 points. This initial layer speed, critical because it's initial. This is defaulted to 20 millimeters per second, so that's really nice and slow, and that's something that you want to keep nice low number. 20 millimeters per second is usually pretty good to make sure that that first layer will stick well. And you have a couple other options here: skirt and brim speed. I've never really messed around too much with acceleration control or jerk control, so it's not something I can really speak to that well. In terms of travel, we talked about enabling retraction. You have a couple other options here on retraction. So for example, how much do you want the filament to retract when you make a jump from one point on the build plate to the other? So during that retraction, this default setting would go to 5 millimeters of retraction, and then it would retract at 45 millimeters per second, meaning it's going to quickly shoot up 5 millimeters at a rate of 45 millimeters per second within the nozzle. And that's going to give you, you can adjust that higher or lower depending on whether or not you're having any issues with oozing. So oozing is a problem that you sometimes have with 3D prints where the material will kind of drip or ooze out of the nozzle itself, and that can ruin your print because that extra material ends up in places on the print that you don't want it. So that's where you might want to change those two values there. So combing mode, I'm not familiar with that, so let's skip over that one. I believe these other settings are related to combing, and so again, we're going to just kind of skip over those in terms of travel for now. So moving on to cooling, there's a lot more settings. So in the basic settings, you basically just have functionality to say whether or not you want your fan active to cool your nozzle, and if you want it, full speed all the time, 100%, or some other constant speed throughout the whole print. This gives you kind of more fine-tuning settings for different cycles within the print. So for example, your regular fan speed would be kind of general, during the main portion of the print, but you may have a maximum fan speed that's set higher. So for example, your regular fan speed you may want only running at 80% at all times, but if there's ever a time where the temperature creeps up a little too high, you could set the maximum fan speed to 100%, and that'll give it a little bit of extra cooling during times when the temperature is a little bit more variable. So that's something you can play around with. I think for the most part you don't need that setting, but it could be helpful if you're having temperature issues within your print. And some of these other settings, again, are related to the speed of the fan. So you can look at these: initial fan speed, regular maximum fan speed, threshold. This one here is definitely interesting. It's called your minimum layer time. So as you get towards the very end of a print, and this is a great example. So when you get to the top of this print, you're here on the finger, and when you're on the finger, the layer is such a small amount of material it needs to add to finish the print that you could have a scenario where it only takes 5 seconds to print a layer, and then it goes to move on to the next layer, and the previous layer hasn't had time to cool down, so it's still mushy. And when you go to print on top of that, you end up getting kind of distortions in the print, and it doesn't look nice. So by setting a minimum layer time, what you're doing is saying, if you get towards the end of the print or any location where the print layer takes less than 10 seconds, take a pause. So for example, if the layer took 6 seconds, it would wait 4 seconds before it started the next layer to make sure that the previous layer has enough time to cool down. And so I think that pretty much covers most of the topics in terms of cooling. For support, again, there's more options here. Instead of just selecting what pattern you want and whether or not you want it touching the build plate or overhang angles, you can also adjust the support density, infill layer thickness, and then you have a couple other options to enable support for the roof or the floor of your model. And I'll let you kind of read through the descriptions here, but as for any settings, either whether it be a basic setting or advanced setting, if I go through something and you have further questions on it, please feel free, leave a comment in the comment section below. I'm always checking and kind of trying my best to respond to all the comments. So if you have any questions, leave those below. Build plate adhesion. There's actually not too many more additional settings. The only additional setting is so for example, skirt, which we talked about here. This is our skirt. You can see that there are 3 line counts. So if we change this to 5, for example, we can also reslice here. once the preview comes up, you can see now we have 5 lines here for the skirt. So this is just, I think typically, 2 or 3 is more than sufficient for skirt, but you may find that you want less or more lines, and you can set that here in your build plate adhesion. We're not going to, again, go over dual extrusion. The Ender 5 here is just a single extruder. So that's not a setting that I'm familiar with, and I don't need to use that. And most 3D printers are just a single nozzle. So some additional settings that come up in advanced, there are special modes. So special modes, you have 2 options here. You could print your entire model all at once, or you could print one at a time. So what does that mean? So if we look here within Cura, I'm going to actually click on the model, and if you ever need to delete it, you just hit delete here, right? So let's say you wanted to print multiple frogs within the same platform, and you wanted to print 3 copies of these, right? So you may add one on there, and then you say, okay, you know what, I actually want to print 2 of these, and you add another frog onto the platform. Okay, so now we've got these 2 on here, and these should give us a preview here in just a minute after it loads. So if you select all at once, it's going to start printing both frogs at the same time. So if we kind of scroll down all the way here to the first layer, you can see that as it's building up, it's building both of them at the same time. If I come here and select one at a time, this is going to actually print one frog in its entirety and then move over to the other frog here. So in most cases, that's not something that you would want to do. In most cases, you're just going to want to print it all at once. But if you do have a scenario where you're maybe, for example, it's a really long print and you're printing more than one, and you're worried that the print's going to fail, after half the print time, then this may give you an option to say, hey, print the first one, and then maybe that one's fine, and it fails on the second one. So there's it does allow you some likelihood that maybe you get a successful print for one, but not the other. Again, I think this is a setting that most of the time you're just going to want to print it all at once, but you may have a scenario where you want to print it individually. Now, I mentioned in the beginning of the video something called spiralize mode. So if you see this checkbox here, this is called spiralize outer contours. And this is a really interesting mode that only makes sense for certain types of models. This is a great example of something that you would want to print in spiral mode. So what spiral mode does is print just a single perimeter outside. So here, this entire model, it's a base. So they print an initial layer, and then the entire thing, it has 0 infill, and it's just one perimeter layer that goes all the way around the outside. So in something like this, this is something that is perfect for spiralize. And the beauty of a spiral mode is that you get prints that print incredibly fast because it's just a base layer and an outer perimeter. So this is a good example. There are other types of models where, again, you really only care about the outer surface. You don't need any strength to the model, no supports, no infill, really kind of simple models, but it can cut your print time down pretty dramatically, and you can have really fast prints that way. So it's definitely something that I would check out at some point. And the last kind of options here, so these are experimental. You could think of these as like beta versions for the software. It's something that honestly, I haven't used these settings very much, but there's an option to make overhang printable, enable conical support, or use adaptive layers. And using adaptive layers, that's kind of an interesting one. It'll actually change the layer heights depending on the shape of the model. So it's basically using some logic within the software to say, based off of the geometry, let's make this layer a little bit thicker or a little bit maybe not as tall. And it's making some adaptive layer choices for you. But again, these are experimental settings, and for the most part, I don't think you need them. But there's something that you could try out and kind of see how it impacts your print. So that's it for kind of covering all the settings. As I mentioned, if you have any questions or comments, please leave those in the comment section below. If you found any value in the video, consider liking the video, give it a thumbs up. And if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing. It really helps the channel out for the YouTube algorithm to know that people are interested in the content and they're finding value from it. So thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.